Why, hello there, you. So today is a day in which I've decided to create a new video, and in this video I will pit two games which are somewhat similar against each other, that being Octopath Traveler and Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Now, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 came out last year, and Octopath Traveler came out a bit more recently. And I have had the opportunity to play both of them sort of back-to-back, sort of concurrently, because my friend loaned me Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Thanks for that, buddy. Appreciate it. But yeah, so I'm basically just going to go through a variety of different categories and compare these two different games and sort of what their strengths are and what they do well. This is sort of coming from me in the position of sort of a JRPG layman. I've mostly just played the Pokemon games in terms of my RPG experience. So that's going to be sort of my perspective, my unique, uninteresting perspective on these games, and how I will discuss them in this video here. And this will also function as sort of a dual review of both games. So, you know, there's that. Fun stuff abounds, my lads. Alright, hit the cool intro. First category, the visuals. And first up we have Octopath Traveler. So Octopath Traveler has this really interesting and unique art direction. It has beautiful lighting. The visuals very well suited to the Switch. It can be a bit imperfect at times in TV mode when it's blown up on the screen, but in handheld mode it's pretty much flawless. So yeah, just a very beautiful looking game. Overall, I would say the visuals are fantastic. Next up in this is Xenoblade Chronicles 2. So I would say Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is a pretty game. It has a really incredible scope, some really vast environments in this game. Though close up, obviously, it doesn't look quite as nice, but it's still impressive as a whole. Just looking around the scenery and such. Cutscenes can be really stunning at times, though other times a little less so. But we'll touch on that later. One thing I do have to note about the battles is that resolution dropping can occur. And so you look at the screenshot here. This is from a particularly hectic battle. And the resolution drop is very noticeable and kind of distracting. It doesn't really detract from gameplay, but from the experience, it's a bit of a bummer. I would say most egregiously is that handheld mode has some really questionable performance. Pretty consistently, just low resolution. It's still playable, but you do feel like you're getting a rather inferior version from TV mode, which is unfortunate because, you know, most Switch games you're going to want to be able to play them in handheld and TV mode, and if a game only really works in TV mode, it's not quite as compelling in my view. Obviously, if you only play games on TV, that's not a problem, but if, you know, a large portion of people, myself included, enjoy playing games in handheld mode, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is one where you will have a very compromised visual experience, which is unfortunate, but still playable, still works fine. Overall, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, when it looks good, it looks really good. But when it doesn't, it's not great. Because you have Octopath Traveler, which has such a unique and interesting art direction. And you have Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which also has some really fantastic visuals, but just the performance can be hindered by the limitations of the Switch's hardware. Okay, on to the next category, music/sound design. So first up, we'll discuss Octopath Traveler. Octopath Traveler features some really beautiful orchestrated tracks. I think they're largely orchestrated. There's some really great variety in there in terms of the instrumentation and melodies. And I'd say very importantly, the songs are incredibly catchy, particularly a lot of the battle music, which it's just some good stuff. Some tracks, such as some of the tracks they use throughout cutscenes, can be a bit overused at times. And as fantastic as the battle music is, there were times when, you know, it's a little repetitive. But minor. These are minor qualms. The sound design is also really great in terms of the, you know, such as the footsteps and the sound effects during battle. They're really punchy. Just traversing the environments just feels very pleasant and tranquil. Pretty much my only complaint about the sound design specifically is that in the default settings of the game, the voice clips that are played during battle are a bit loud. So when you're playing with headphones, perhaps in handheld mode, you'll have these really loud voice tracks, which are sort of not ideal when you're just trying to listen to the music, because obviously you're going to be really into the music, and then you'll have these really loud voice tracks, so you're going to want to adjust those, but that's just a minor complaint, and far less noticeable in TV mode, so yeah, just a minor complaint there. Overall, the music and sound design in Octopath Traveler is just amazing. Now we will move on to Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and its music/sound design. Similarly, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 has some really beautiful orchestrated sounding tracks. I don't know if they are, but just truly wonderful music in this game. Now moving on to the sound design, I do have a few more complaints about that. Specifically, in some of the cutscenes, the soundscape is just really empty, so you'll have the voice actors talking, but then the background sound is just like, it's just dead air, and it's a little weird to sit through.
Lila! Wait!
And then I brought this up with Octopath Traveler. In Xenoblade Chronicles 2, the voice clips that are played during battle, not only are they loud, but they're sometimes they can be pretty constant, especially if you have multiple enemies on the screen. So you're going to want to fiddle with the options there. I would recommend lowering the battle sound settings, because they're a little extreme, especially if you want to try and listen to the music, which can be effectively drowned out sometimes by the voice clips. So, that was a little weird. I'm not really sure why they did that, but hey, at least it can be adjusted. Overall, I would say the music/sound design in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is truly wonderful, despite the flaws. Okay, now we're moving on to some of the bigger talking points, which is the gameplay. So Octopath Traveler's gameplay is sort of set up in this sort of chapter system. You'll be going through each chapter subsequently. You have to go to the first 8 towns to meet up with your fellow travelers, to get all the travelers all together. And then after that, you go to their subsequent chapters, like every character has a chapter 2 and so on. And at first that might seem a bit repetitive, but I found that it did really work, and there was enough variance in the sort of locales and the storylines that each chapter included that it definitely worked, and it didn't end up feeling like I was doing the same thing over and over again, largely. So the structure of Octopath Traveler is fairly non-linear in that you can do whatever chapter in pretty much whatever order you want, which is pretty cool. It sort of encourages you to sort of skip around between characters' storylines, so you get a lot of variety in terms of which characters you're following and sort of their internal struggles and whatnot. And the locations are always changing up, and you'll get some new enemies and the bosses. So it's cool that it sort of encourages you to play in whatever order you see fit. I appreciate that. I think that's pretty neat. So the characters in Octopath Traveler all have sort of unique characteristics that can be utilized in battle and also outside of battle in the overworld. And the game does a pretty great job, I'd say, in introducing you to each of the characters' different mechanics, and also the game mechanics on a whole. So exploring the overworld and the towns is pretty satisfying. Finding treasures and talking to the townspeople and interacting with them and with each of your characters' specific path actions, which is sort of how the characters interact with those people. They can steal from them or beat them up or buy stuff from them or enlist them to fight for you. Pretty cool stuff there. And what I do appreciate is that there's never really an excessive amount of things to do. It's always pretty clear what you need to do, and you don't really feel overwhelmed by the amount of people asking you to do things or the different side quests. It's all very self-contained, and I appreciated that because it gives you a more focused experience when you're playing through those chapters. That applies to the locations and the environments as well. as they're all sort of tailored to shorter play sessions. So dungeons, etc., don't tend to be that long, so you can basically get through them in one sitting. So yeah, they're all very appropriately sized, which is very cool. Very good design there. And another fortunate thing is that the cutscenes and dialogue sequences throughout the game are all very well paced and don't ever take too long before you can get back into the action of the gameplay. So that was nice. And Octopath Traveler does feature side quests, but they're never really given much of a focus, which, depending on your perspective, could be a bad or good thing. From my perspective, I found that totally acceptable because I was more interested in partaking in the main story quest than I was the side quests. One of Octopath Traveler's strongest aspects, I'd say, is the combat system. It really didn't take long to get a grasp on how to do things in battle, and it features this really cool and effective and easy to understand weakness system, which reminded me a lot of the Pokemon. You know, weakness systems, always nice. So exploiting the enemy's weaknesses is always very satisfying, and when you do that, it'll sort of break down the enemy's defenses and gives you an opportunity to attack them. So just a very engaging and satisfying gameplay system there. And despite the battle's simplicity, I would say, there is a lot of depth to them, and you have a lot of different options which you can use at any given time, especially as you progress through the game. You unlock, more stuff that your characters can do, or abilities and whatnot. And what I really like is that every character in your party feels very unique from one another, and they all have their own value, and there's some really creative ways in which they can do battle. And one thing I do love about the game is how user-friendly all the item and skill management systems are. You pretty much understand what every item will do, and it gives you like a little description of what it does. It's all very easy to understand, won't take you too long to get the hang of it. And that's a very good thing. Boss battles can be quite the undertaking in Octopath Traveler. They can take upwards of 20 minutes, at least sometimes. So, depending on your level, they can be really tricky. And that was really nice because the game isn't that hard. So, being faced with the challenge of the boss fights is really nice. And speaking of difficulty, one nice thing about it is that if you play a chapter and you're under-leveled and you get to the boss and you just can't quite defeat him, that happened to me, you can, exit that chapter and then go back to it later and, in the meantime do a different chapter and complete that, perhaps an easier chapter, and then go back to the one you're originally at, and you'll be strong enough to defeat that boss. So that was a very cool system, and just one of the options that's opened up by having a non-linear structure. And one thing I really do love about Octopath Traveler is that grinding is not really something you're going to need to do throughout the game, because you will get enough experience and battle items just throughout the course of the game that it isn't really necessary, and I liked that a lot. I thought that was a good thing to have, and I think it's really nice to see the developers at Square Enix, and related parties sort of embracing the unique features that the Switch has. Look, we're on a screensaver. It's fine. The game can be enjoyed fully well in TV mode, but in handheld mode it really shines, and the gameplay just works incredibly well for a portable system. And the game is really accommodating if you want to take a break or just play for a short burst. It's just all flows together very well. It seems like they really had the Switch's capabilities in mind while creating this game. Overall, the gameplay in Octopath Traveler I would describe as stellar. Now moving on to Xenoblade Chronicles 2 in terms of the gameplay. Okay, Xenoblade 2's gameplay is a bit rough in the beginning. It takes a bit of time to get into, which is not helped by these walls of text which you will encounter a lot throughout the beginning of the game. For a while, you're just being shown wall after text, wall of text after wall of text, and it's like, oh, I don't know what any of this means. Leave me alone. So I don't really think that's a great way of introducing people to mechanics. Just by writing it out in a mandatory speech bubble is not exactly ideal, and it does feel a bit overwhelming, especially for someone such as myself who is less experienced with games in this genre. So despite the lackluster opening, the base gameplay itself is pretty simple. You essentially just traverse to the required location, and then that will trigger a cutscene or battle or other such things. The battles in Xenoblade do take a bit to figure out, but they aren't really all that difficult. You basically just automatically attack an enemy, and then you have these special moves that charge up, and then you can attack using those. And those will all do more damage and are vital to victory. One thing I will say about the battle system in Xenoblade is that while I did grasp the basics, I was a bit more in a fog in terms of the more advanced mechanics. I wasn't exactly sure what was going on there, and I wasn't really sure if there was more I could be doing at any given point. And then outside of battles, you have a similar sort of issue in that there's just a lot of different side quests and shop vendors and different items you can get and different enemies you can fight. So it's a little overwhelming at first. You're like, oh, there's so many things to do. But if you just focus on the main story path, it is pretty basic. You can just follow the story path and not worry too much about the extra content, and then perhaps go back to that later when you feel you have a better grasp on the game as a whole. So yeah, Xenoblade features this sort of blades system, which you sort of switch between these supporting characters, which switch the weapons, and customizing and figuring out how to optimize the blades and also your playable characters properly was a bit tricky. I wasn't really sure what specifically did what. It was a little obtuse, and finding what upgrades would be most beneficial was a bit daunting. And one unfortunate aspect of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is that you can have a bit of grinding in there, which isn't terrible, but I don't love. This is helped a bit by this sort of system where you can get these sort of extra levels by slipping in an inn, so that's appreciated, sort of a bit of a user-friendly thing. But yeah, there is definitely some grinding in here. So just keep that in mind. And then there's also a lot of cutscenes in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which is not inherently a bad thing, but there are times when you kind of wish you could get away from the cutscene and continue with the gameplay. You're like, let's go. But that does get better as you play, and you just sort of get used to it. So it's not that bad. I can't help but feel that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 could have done a much better job of introducing players to mechanics in a more intuitive way, given the relative complexity of them. And it kind of feels like you're just being tossed into the deep end without much actual instruction. Like, I'm gonna drown. Then you figure out how to swim on your own. You're like, all right, now I got it. And one positive point is that if you want a game with a lot of things to do that'll keep you busy for many, many hours, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 that would be a good choice, because there's a whole lot of things in this game. There's a whole lot of stuff. So yeah, if you want something to keep you busy, this would be a thing. So overall, the gameplay does have a bit of a rough start, but does end up being a deep and enjoyable experience. All right, so we have our next category, which is cutscenes / voice acting. Now, since these are both JRPG thingamajigs, they obviously have a big focus on cutscenes and, by extension, the voice acting. So I thought I would discuss those things. So I would describe Octopath Traveler's cutscenes as a bit of a mixed bag. Some are really well paced and written and voiced. While there are some others which struggle a bit and are kind of a chore to sit through. One aspect of the cutscenes I do commend is that they are very well placed throughout each chapter, and they don't tend to take too long generally. And I think just looking at the characters, there are clearly some who are a bit underwritten compared to others. A character I do feel a particular need to mention, however, is Hanit. So while her storyline and character traits are perfectly serviceable, totally fine, I really kind of despised the decision that the localization team made to have Hanit and her fellow village people speak in this particularly grating imitation of Old English.
This bodeth ill.
Didn't really like that. I don't really know why they did that. Presumably to differentiate Hanit and the villagers as the forest people with their own sort of special dialect. One additional thing about Octopath's cutscenes and dialogue sequences is that a majority of the sequences are not fully voiced. They feature these sort of half sentences and vocalizations, which didn't really bother me that much since the most important cutscenes are given full voicing. So it is just a minor thing. And then the voice acting itself is largely pretty great, I would say. It's There are some exceptions, some which are not as good, but I think, overall they do the job very, very nicely. Overall, I would say the music and voice acting in Octopath Traveler is pretty good. And then there is Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and its voice acting and cutscenes. And there's a lot of cutscenes. So the cutscenes in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 are a bit interesting in that there's basically two different classes of cutscenes. The first of which are the most important cutscenes, I'll refer to as the A cutscenes. The A cutscenes because they're most important. And the A cutscenes, like, wow, these are really, really well animated. Looks like they use some sort of motion capture. The voice acting is usually really on point, really, really well done across the board. Just everything about them, they're just really incredibly well produced and really impressive to look at. And then we have the lower class of cutscenes, which I'll refer to as the B cutscenes, as they are, less important. And these are definitely more frequent than the A cutscenes. These are sort of the cutscenes that you'll be seeing throughout the majority of the game. And the B cutscenes, while not particularly bad, the step down from the A cutscenes is really noticeable, and the character movements on a whole is just a lot more stiff and more like video gamey, which is unfortunate but also understandable because budgetary reasons. You can't have like 20 hours of highly produced cutscenes. Something has to give. That's how it is. It's not ideal, but it's definitely works, and it's really elevated by the voice cast. Who still, even in the B cutscenes, is totally giving it their all. And then one complaint I do have about Xenoblade Chronicles 2 in terms of its cutscenes / voice acting is the Nopon species as a whole. They decided to give the Nopon this fairly obnoxious grammatical style.
Actually, friends, Tora did think of name for her. Very good name.
Which you do get used to, but I don't really like at all. I kind of wish they didn't talk the way they do. They speak sort of like I don't even know what. Another thing I will say about the cutscenes is that while it's not excessively prevalent, there is a fair amount of anime nonsense.
Get out! Interloper! Monster!
Wait a minute, would you? Ow!
So if that's not your kind of thing, just, brace for that. While the B cutscenes are a downside, the predominantly stellar voice cast and beautiful A cutscenes do make up for it. Okay, well, on to our final category of the day. I know. Just bear with me. I know it's been a lot. It's a lot of information to take in. But we're almost there. And that is the story element. The story element in Octopath Traveler and Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Obviously, story, RPG, go together. How does it work? I don't know. I'm going to tell you. Okay. The story in Octopath Traveler is sadly not as strong as it could have been. Since there are 8 different main characters, there is a bit of a lack of cohesion throughout, and the truly sparse amount of interaction between the main characters seems like a pretty big oversight. During cutscenes, when you have multiple party members together, they don't really appear and interact at all, and you just get these tiny little bite-sized moments where they talk to each other after a big event has happened or something like that. And those are pretty infrequent. While the individual chapters do tell effective, contained little stories, which are usually enjoyable enough, there isn't really any kind of end goal for the most part, or even a reason why these 8 different people are traveling together, leading to the story element in Octopath Traveler feeling a bit more hollow than it could have been. Overall, the story element's decent. It's pretty alright. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, story element, let's go. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, on the other hand, is a fair bit more effective in its narrative efforts. For one, there are a lot of cutscenes, which gives the characters time to develop and grow, and provide context for the world of All Rest in which the game takes place. The game's story is really elevated by the voice actors' performances and the 8 cutscenes, which punctuate important plot points beautifully. Xenoblade 2's more linear structure allows it a more focused and refined narrative experience than Octopath, and in this it just excels. Overall, I would say the story element in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is fantastic. Okay, we've done battle. The games have punched each other, they've kicked each other. It's been a real tough time, and now it's time for the summary. What do we take away from this? Well, Octopath's narrative, in my view, is simply not as compelling as Xenoblade's. The unique art style and more refined and simple gameplay experience was just far more effective in my view. And despite Xenoblade's haphazard introduction and overly complex gameplay, the game really does shine in its best moments. In terms of sheer content, it really just can't be beat. That being said, the Octopath art style just does not get old to look at. Wow, what a nice looking game. So that is, in large part, the duration of my thoughts on these two games. If I had to recommend one, it would probably be Octopath. In large part just because as an experience it is far more consistent and well suited to the Nintendo Switch than Xenoblade. As fantastic as Xenoblade really is, I'd also recommend that as well, but Octopath for me is just that's a top tier game, whereas Xenoblade is also it's up there. It's not quite there. Just its shortcomings just aren't allowing it to get quite on the same level for me personally. So that was a pretty long video, eh? I think I've talked enough for now. Probably sick of my voice. I know I am. Catch you later. See you around.